I'm going to talk about something completely different, really looking at the future rather than at the present, but about the way that the future is unwinding, unfurling in the present, really at digital employment platforms and the ways in which they appear to be changing our understanding of appropriate employment regulation. These discussions, the issues that I'm raising here, are also appropriate to debates about, wider debates about changes in social protection regimes that have already been raised here. But I'm really looking here at broad social dynamics and the ways in which they link technical change, social policy, and regimes of accumulation. And this is new research that I've just been doing in Nigeria over the summer, so if it's disjointed, I'm still chewing on it. The issue that I'm looking at here is the gig economy, or digital employment platforms, also known as the sharing economy, the on-demand economy. This refers to things like Uber, which we all know well, Elance, data, micro work, Amazon's Digital Turk. There's a South African domestic employment app called Domestly, another one called Sweep South. Nigeria has a few now, Wisabi, which gets you artisans, plumbers, carpenters, painters, etc. So these things are growing, not just here, but in many parts of Africa. And I am focusing what I'm saying on the African scene empirically, but some of the issues are relevant to the developed as well as the developing world. Now, the rise of the gig economy has been accompanied by calls for a new social contract in order to deliver on the promise of expanding high-quality employment that the gig economy seems to offer. This seems very attractive in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, of Africa more broadly, in a situation in which very high levels of growth since 2000, ranging from about 5% average for a decade, falling to about 3% average growth rates, has been accompanied by persistent poverty and by expanding informal economies. And this is seen as the great paradox of jobless growth. At the same time, across much of Africa, this jobless growth is confronting a demographic tsunami. Very rapid population growth, twice the level of the global average, putting about 10 to 12 million new workers onto the labor market every year. So anything that can deliver good quality jobs fast is very appealing. So the question is, can the calls for a new social contract and the kind of new social contract being referred to turn the precarious informal work that seems to be expanding in sub-Saharan Africa right now into decent work for this expanding young labor force? Now, it's important to start by looking at the old social contract and what are the concerns about why that's no longer appropriate. On the one hand, the concerns are that the state has had plenty of time to deliver on the promise of the old social contract to protect labor, deliver social protection, and it has failed. On the other hand, what we have now is very unfair, especially in developing countries, where precarious work is the norm, where there are large informal economies, and yet what is protected by the social contract is just the tiny pool of formal work in a great sea of precarity. So that is seen as very unfair. Now, the gig economy offers the option of linking this huge informal labor force and unemployed labor force and the youth coming on to the labor force into modern jobs, high-quality jobs, and doing it expanding very quickly. Certainly the gig economy is famous for scaling up quickly. Uber has expanded to over 80 countries in under 10 years, and we all know the stories of Amazon and Jumia and various other digital employment platforms and marketing platforms that have expanded extremely rapidly, partially because of financialization. But you have a situation in which, if you look at the screen there, you turn the informal labor force across much of African cities into this kind of nice, uniformed, professional-looking labor force working in as an Uber driver, as a Wisabi artisan, as a professional domestic cleaner. The question is whether this idea that it must be this expansion of the gig economy needs to be accompanied by a new social contract that is fit for purpose. What does that mean? This new social contract that is fit for purpose of the gig economy is one that is extended to all workers, regardless of whether they're working formally or informally, and that is funded by general taxation. And the question that I want to ask in the rest of this presentation is, if it's fit for purpose, whose purpose are we focusing on? So the next slide. Now, before looking at that purpose, it's important to think about what is the wider purpose of a social contract. A social contract sounds really good, but literature on the social contract points out that social contracts are not necessarily progressive. They can be bargains to promote or improve the common good, but they can also be devices to legitimate existing inequalities or even new unequal arrangements. So if we look at the new social contract, we need to parse exactly what it's offering and think about the extent to which this is likely to be a progressive social contract or one that legitimizes inequalities. Now, on the one hand, the new social contract that I just indicated, extended to all workers, formal and informal, and funded by general taxation, it completely airbrushes out the role of capital. Social contract is supposed to be not just a dyadic bargain between the state and society, it's supposed to be a tripartite bargain among the state, society, and capital. It is about not just delivering services to people or social protection to citizens, but about holding capital to account for the delivery of decent and dignified work in that process. The second concern is the concern of fairness. The new social contract frames fairness as inequalities between workers. Formal workers are getting a better deal than informal workers. This is unfair. But the social contract is really supposed to be about distributive fairness across the economy. Distributive fairness, not just of social protection, but of the distribution of resources throughout the growth process. That means that it's about distribution between capital and labor, not just between formal and informal labor. A third concern is that it's important when calling for a new social contract to think about what led to the demise of the old social contract. The demise of the old social contract was not just an agentless social process resulting from globalization and technical change. It was actively dismantled by a whole range of state and international financial actors through programs that were implemented over periods of decades. And it is very much the same actors who dismantled the old social contract through austerity and liberalization and anti-union legislation, etc., who are now the ones calling for a new social contract. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but that sets off my alarm bells. So when you look more closely at what they're calling for, this new social contract, rather than delivering on the future of work, makes you feel like it's a bit of a back to the future of work, because much of the labor process created by the gig economy, by the future of work, looks disturbingly similar to the labor process of the early 19th century, which was based on a very similar framework of casualization, piecework, workers using their own capital equipment, and highly insecure work. The only thing that's different is the digital dimension, okay? And because of that digital dimension, it tends to create a kind of futuristic glow around a labor process that actually is disturbingly backward rather than futuristic. Thinking about the old social contract is also important. The unraveling of the old social contract is important because it reminds us that this is not the first time that the social contract has collapsed in the face of technical change and shifting power relations. It happened during the 19th century. It happened again. Is happening again during this period, and it has been dealt with before. And looking at the ways in which we responded to the collapse of the previous 19th century social contract, or 18th century social contract, kind of helps us keep our eye on the sparrow. That responding to the new social contract is very much about keeping your eye on decent work and distributive fairness. Now, I'm going to look at these issues in the context of some work on digital taxis in Nigeria. I call them digital taxis. The technical term is e-hailing or ride-hailing, but in Nigeria, when I used any of those terms, nobody knew what I was talking about, so I have started calling them digital taxis. I'm going to flip through this very quickly because I have 5 minutes left. So in the next slide, just flashing up that this was research on digital taxis, Uber and Taxify, which are international, Oga Taxi, which is the biggest of the Nigerian ones, in two cities, Abuja and Lagos, in Nigeria between June and August, and the work is based on a range of interviews and a survey of 200 digital taxi drivers in those two cities. So if we can have the next one. When you look at what's been going on in the digital taxi space, one of the things that becomes clear is, A, it doesn't create that many jobs. If you add up the jobs created by Oga Taxi, Uber, and Taxify, it sounds like 21,000 jobs, but if you keep in mind that many of the drivers are part-time, they already have another job, and they work for Oga Taxi, Taxify, and Uber simultaneously, it actually boils down to just over 7,000 jobs. Mm-hmm. It also displaces a lot of jobs, car hire or car rental, and taxi drivers. So the net impact on employment doesn't look that great. The fabulous incomes that they promise boil down to something much less satisfactory in a context in which they also have to pay for petrol, airtime, car repair, etc., and in which rapid entry is bidding down the gains, and in which there are many drivers without cars, so they have to make returns that amount to about 36% of the income to the owner of the car, on top of the 25% to the taxi company, or 15%, depending on the company. So actually, more than half of drivers earned something very close to minimum wage in Nigeria, about 22,000 in a minimum wage environment of 18,000. Working hours were very long, and the adequacy of the income can be indicated by the very high turnover. Uber has been in Nigeria for 4 years now, but the average length of time people were doing this work was just over 8 months, which has something to do, indicates that the sustainability per person of this activity is very low, but there are so many people that keep coming in, it's quite sustainable for the digital taxi platforms. The whole issue of whether regulations are obsolete, what one can see if we look at digital taxis is that, in fact, regulations are being evaded, but it's not clear that they are simply obsolete. Digital taxi drivers are defined as independent, but they're highly regulated by algorithms and corporate regulations that make them, in fact, very much unindependent in their work regime. Many regular taxi drivers describe them as enslaved. And in addition, digital taxi firms define themselves as technology, not transport companies, which allows them to evade a whole range of taxes that are essential for the funding of transport. So are they more efficient, or are they just efficient at evading regulations that the formal end of the industry has to pay for? If one were to think about whether digital taxis make a contribution to the social good through improvements in urban transport, that doesn't look so good either. The reality is they claim to be more convenient, provide data for planning, reduce congestion. The reality in Lagos and Abuja both is that digital taxis are statistically invisible to planners. They find them completely unuseful for planning, and the companies don't share their data. They evade taxes and therefore undermine contributions to improving public transport. And the main issue is that urban transport strategy in both Lagos and Abuja and in many developing countries is based on mass transport, not taxis. Digital taxis cost about 4 times what a bus journey costs. A return trip might be 1,000 to 2,000 naira in a country with a minimum wage of 18,000 naira a month. 1 minute to go. So digital taxis are not available to most people and undercut the main urban transport strategies of the place, which involve mass transport and getting cars off the road, not making more cars that are usually parked part of the day go on the road. The final issue is the issue of the dignity of work. The social dimensions of decent work are not being taken into account in thinking about what are appropriate gig economy activities. Driving in Nigeria is a lowly activity, especially commercial driving. It's precarious, it's unregistered, and it is like being a domestic servant. But because of the language and the technical requirements, most digital taxi drivers are university graduates, 59%, and they found the work highly demeaning because they were acting as a domestic servant to people who were often less educated than they were, but treated them like underlings. Both because of precarity and because of the loss of dignity, 41% of digital taxi drivers don't see it as a job, and only 25% of them, more than 50% don't see it as a job, and only 25% saw it as a formal activity. And in addition, the cultural stereotype that associates commercial drivers with illiterate Hausa Fulani people meant that the largest ethnic group in the country stayed away from the activity. Only 3.5% of digital taxi drivers came from that ethnic group. So, conclusion. The conclusion is much of this new social contract, when you scratch the surface, looks a lot more like a social con than a social contract. Companies that evade contributions to social welfare and to state revenue for the expansion of transport are arguing that general taxation should be used to make up the gap in social protection. That is a transfer of resources from labor to capital. So it's not looking out for labor and improving the social conditions of labor. It's actually creating a regime to make it easier to withdraw protection from labor. I won't go any further, but just point out that the whole process of shaping the social contract takes place nonetheless through various forms of resistance, court cases, social media to trigger strikes, that the social pressures to shape the social contract are not moving in the same direction as the digital economy supposes. And I'll leave it there.